as I leafed through Inscriptiones Graecae, collecting information from our doctoral thesis, I came across the inscriptions of the temple manager of Delos. Inscriptions that included much more information on prices, salaries, rents, and values than I had thought existed. I started recording the information on index cards, but think that a machine could probably do it faster. I wrote a set of computer programs that indeed succeeded in collecting a huge amount of information from the inscriptions of the Delian hero Poia. I was very proud of myself. At the same time, people with a broader view of possibilities worked on the problem from a more general point of view and invented relational databases and became millionaires. Those people were giants of the digital world. I am best curiosity. With this experience behind me, I have a sense of déjà vu introducing Simon Hornblower. He is 2 or 3 years younger than I, but when I was being tested on Plautus Herodotus in Roman Judea, he was being tested for prize fellowship at All Souls, known as the hardest test in the world. Hilaire Belloc, Hugh Trevor Roper, and Harold Wilson tried for these fellowships in different years and didn't get it, but Simon Hornblower did. When I was collecting that material on the piglets bought each year in Delphi, in Delos, he published a history of the Greek world that has already seen his 4th edition. When I was advising a student who was translating a few satires of Juvenal, he was writing a commentary of Thucydides that nobody realized we needed until he wrote and we found out what we had been missing. When I was trying to finish up my book on the invention of money, he and Andrew Spalforth were editing the 3rd edition of the Oxford Classical Dictionary, the edition that freed the OCD from the chronologically and geographically limited and literal-minded tradition of the earlier editions, and introduced entries on alcoholism, contraception, and, especially for us, Dead Sea Scrolls, rabbis, and Galilee. That was 20 years ago. He has not neglected to update the OCD twice, but he has continued to publish on Thucydides, on Pindar, on Lycophron. If you don't know who he is, you can now find out. And others, as they say in the theatre, too numerous to mention. Who but the author of Thucydides and Pindar, historical narrative, and the world of Epinician poetry could tell us about the Hellenistic poets as historians? Nobody else, I presume, so pay close attention to what Simon Hornblower has to say.
Thank you very much indeed, David, for those wonderful words. And can you all hear me? And have you all got a sight of the handout, even if you haven't got your own personal gift copy? Yes? It's quite going to matter. I need to start by thanking the Israel Society for the promotion of classical studies, for doing me the honor of inviting me through its then president, Marguerite, to give this keynote lecture. What's the matter? Microphone, what's the matter? Have I not turned it on?
No. Just put it closer to you. The microphone is for me.
Right. Is that better?
Yeah.
That's better. Okay. Did you hear? I said thank you to the to David Schapp. Thank you to the Israel Society and for its extremely generous hospitality. And I'd like to thank in particular Lisa and Gil and Sonia for their help, always given promptly and extremely efficiently. So many thanks for all that. Well, my title, as David said, is The Hellenistic Poets as Historians. And I don't just mean by that such vague projects as how to extract history from the Hellenistic poets, or history and the Hellenistic poets. They would be easier topics. I'll give a few examples of what I'm not going to do, praeteritio. To take the first, that's extracting history. If we're looking for social history, I could take Theocritus' 14th idyll about and talk about the expectations of a mercenary in the time of Ptolemy II. Or if interested in excavating the poems for religious history, I might be interested in the material about oracular incubation in Lycophron's Alexandra, where the poet deals with the Italian cult of the medical hero Podalirios. Or I might, more excitingly, but I'm not going to do it, take the new evidence for the cult of Diomedes from Adriatic Palagrusa. That was found only in the 1990s, chance excavation, 5th century sherd from this place, in the middle of the Adriatic. The islands of Diomedes were thought to be just the Tremiti Islands off the coast of, the coast of Italy is just here. But now we know that there was more to it than that. Okay. Well, that's what I'm not going to do. The second topic, history and the Hellenistic poets, well, I might talk about their relation to their immediate historical milieu, the patronage of, for instance, the Macedonian kings of Aratus and of the Seleucids, of Euphorion and the main Alexandrian poets, and what they owed to the cultural institutions of Ptolemaic Alexandria. Well, what I'm going to be talking about instead is how Hellenistic poets, whose main themes are, of course, mythological, nevertheless managed to talk about lived events, to narrate lived events of the human past. That is, to function as what we would call historians, or might call historians. And they used four main devices for doing so, and here they are: historical epics, tragedies, aitia, and above all, prophecy, meaning prophecy after the event, of course. I'm going to ask how distinctively Hellenistic those devices are. And the first and most obvious means is the genre which is actually most controversial in its very existence. I mean the historical epics about Hellenistic kings. That was one of the subjects of a very influential book by this man, Konrad Ziegler, Das Hellenistische Epos. He's one of my heroes. Ziegler, he's not Jewish. He was not Jewish. He died in 1974. His life was extremely sad. He's commemorated in Yad Vashem as one of the righteous Gentiles. There may be some people who are not Israeli who don't know this. I expect the Israelis are very familiar with this figure and his life. He helped a lot of Jewish people in the war. He was a social democrat, imprisoned at one time. After the war, Göttingen behaved disgracefully. He never got a proper job. And he died having been made only an honorarius. And in 1974, one or two people behaved particularly badly. A friend of mine called Dr. Yitzhak Dana is writing a biography of him, The Moment, and he hoped to be here today, but he's not able to be with us. So that's Konrad Ziegler. Well, his returning to historical epics, the publication of the so-called New Simonides in 1991 on papyrus provided at last a solid bridge between poetry and historiography. Though that poem was strictly an elegy, not an epic. Even earlier, elegiac poets like Mimnermus had talked about historical events, the Ionian colonization of Western Asia Minor. Well, the New Simonides is a narrative of the Battle of Plataea, 479 BCE. And it shows what could have been done by Hellenistic poets. The importance of that papyrus is that it reduces the generic difference between history and poetry. Aristotle was too strict in his insistence on the difference. That unsatisfactory book, as Bernard Williams once described the Poetics. Aristotle said if you turned Herodotus into verse, it would still be history. But there are irreducible differences between history and poetry. Denis Feeney sought to find them in the what he called the active intervention of the gods in human action. Poetry, not historiography. Not quite as sharp and clear as one might think, because the military role of the Dioscuri is really quite intriguing in the new papyrus. They do seem to have existed in Herodotus' account as well, in Book 5, and were they really somehow thought of as present? That's an epiphany then. Well, Ziegler, coming back to him, thought there were many poems proclaiming the glory of Hellenistic kings and dynasts. But his thesis was the subject of a polemic by Alan Cameron. We're now number 1 on the handout. Again, Cameron, Callimachus and his critics. Cameron observed that, for instance, though Callimachus' Lock of Berenike is an oblique epinikion on Ptolemy Euergetes, his Syrian war of 246, only 3 lines are devoted to the campaign. Again, Theocritus 17 lists the vast possessions of Ptolemy Philadelphus, but is otherwise vague and actually rather silly. Particularly number 2 on the handout, the claim that he founded lots of cities. Well, the Ptolemies were not city founders like the Seleucids, and this may be a form of propagandist claim, but it's an untrue one. In Cameron's view, the chief vehicle for panegyric of Hellenistic kings wasn't the epic, it was the paean. 17 paeans known, and they're very unspecific. So that's how it was done. The moment it seems that Cameron was right against Ziegler, though papyrus finds could change that tomorrow. So you have to be pretty careful how one makes that sort of point. Well, classical Greek poetry knew of another way of presenting narrative, namely by the messenger speeches of tragedy. That's the Theocritus passage, 3 times 10,000. That's clearly rubbish. Well, we're now on to number 2, tragedies, particularly the messenger speeches of tragedy. Could I have a bit more light at this end? That one, is that? Can you get that one on? That's better. That's all right. Thank you. Okay, so I need to look at this. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, only one historical messenger speech. One historical drama survives. Aeschylus's Persians. Phrynichus's Fall of Miletus got its author into terrible trouble. From the Hellenistic period, we have very few tragedies, lots of titles, short fragments. On that subject, Ziegler is again very valuable. This is on the bibliography, this time for a long but neglected entry in Pauli Versova on Tragoidia, which took account of the copious epigraphic evidence for tragedies. There were lots of them. Only 2 Hellenistic tragedies survive in any bulk. One is Lycophron's Alexandra, and that's come down through the manuscript tradition. The other is Ezekiel's Exegogi, of which we have nearly 300 lines quoted by Eusebius from Alexander Polyhistor. It's a versification of the biblical book of Exodus. And in the prologue, I give you this, when Jacob left the land of Canaan, so on and so on. King Pharaoh, when he saw our race increasing in number, devised many plans against us. And again, we get a bit of narrative later on. The messenger speech is used to describe the pursuit from Egypt and the parting of the Red Sea. Well, that's probably 2nd century BC, which is the date to which I would put the Alexandra as well. Well, did Ezekiel think he was writing history? That's a pretty treacherous topic, but it's probable, and there are many stylistic reminiscences of Aeschylus's Persian. So that suggests that he did think he was in that kind of game. But I won't need to go into such questions as whether Pharaoh is or is not the historical Ramesses II. Okay, I'll come back to messenger speeches when I get to Lycophron. There were other ingenious ways in which poets covered past events which took place in human time. Many of my examples will be from the sphere of colonization. Mythical acts of foundation were often thought of as preceding, as happening before the historical ones. And we'll see how poets coped with that transition. One such technique was etiology. And that's my 3rd category, aitia. That's to say, questions calling for learned answers. That's specifically Hellenistic and associated with Callimachus in particular. I'll give you an example, nice one, I think, from your number 5 on the handout, about Zancli, later Messina in Sicily. The muse Clio speaks in Callimachus. She rests her arm on her sister's shoulder. And she says, the people, one group from Kyme, the other from Chalkis, led by Perieres and the willful and mighty Cretaimenes, set foot on Trinacria, that's Sicily, and built a wall round the town. I've given the Greek in number 5 on the handout. Well, here's Thucydides. The oikis were Perieres and Cretaimenes, the one from Kyme, the other from Chalkis. And at first it was called Zancli. All Callimachus has done is versify Thucydides, pretty well word for word. If Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, is the sister on whom Clio rests her shoulder, on whose shoulder Clio rests her arm, that would be a very neat signifier for what I was saying about the 2 genres being very close. But the muses don't get their separate functions perhaps till later than Callimachus. But be that as it may, Callimachus here operates as a historian by the device of a question about who founded Zancli. No mention of Thucydides as far as we can see. But in another interesting passage, this is number 6 on the handout, we have Callimachus citing a prose historian by name. In the marriage of Acontius and Caidippe, this is one of the fragments of the Aitia again. He has an excursus on the founders of the island of Keos. And here he explicitly invokes a prose historian, Xenomedes, who set down all the island in a mythological history. Mythologos, mythic tales, but Annette Harder and Robert Fowler have taken this, I think rightly, to mean local history, particularly prehistory. Callimachus's explicit dependence on prose predecessors of the stature of Thucydides and Xenomedes doesn't reduce the poet's claim to be writing something like history. Otherwise, we'd have to say that Livy is not history because he's following Polybius. Okay, so that's to deal with an obvious objection. And indeed, we might have trouble categorizing Thucydides himself because he seems to have followed Antiochus of Syracuse in the Sicelica. Does that make Thucydides a non-historian? I think Professor Price would not agree with that. Okay. Maybe Callimachus drew on Antiochus direct because Antiochus survived in the time of Strabo. Okay, but the main device, we move on, by which a poet could narrate events of the past is by means of pseudo-prophecy, my fourth genre. There's a classical precursor, Pindar's fourth Pythian, which has Medea predicting a historical event, namely the foundation of Cyrene from Thera. It's quite short. But the Hellenistic poet who does this in a big way is Lycophron, the author of the Alexandria. And on that poem, the best monograph remains that of Conrad Ziegler, 1927, an absolutely wonderful piece of work, right on every point, in my view, including the date, not 3rd century, but 2nd. But first, let's look at what a Hellenistic poet has to do, the trouble he gets into when he refuses to make extensive use of prophecy. The poet I have in mind is Apollonius Rhodius, and the poem is the Argonautica. Well, refusal is a surprising word when you consider what we were told yesterday by Professor Pascalis about the proem, about Apollo and the prophecy to Pelias. But that stops there. There's very little prophecy except how the Argonauts can achieve a successful nostos. That is a sort of self-imposed austerity, which put... Can you still hear me at the back? Am I... Yep. It put him in a difficult position. He's a precise writer, and he avoids anachronism, something we were hearing about yesterday, namely the anachronism of showing awareness of historical city foundations which lay in the future at the time of the Argo. Thus, in Book 1, this is number 8 on the handout, he says the Argonaut Polyphemus will found Mysian Chios, that's K-I-O-S, not like K-O-S, K-A-E-O-S, which was Xenomedes. That pointedly ignores a very important historical fact, Miletus, Milesian colonization of the Black Sea region. And that's something that the commentators on Apollonius don't seem to have really got to grips with. Apollonius several times invokes an ancient and very useful colonial myth, the network of the daughters of Asopos, the Asopidae. Number 9 on the handout, this is. It was the subject of a poem by Corinna, who I take to be Hellenistic, first published by Villomowitz. Asopos's daughters were a family of nymphs, a sort of sisterhood. And anthropologists call that sort of thing horizontal kinship as opposed to vertical. As a simple example, number 11 on the handout, a sisterhood between Taras, Tarentum in Italy, and Cnidos in Asia Minor. He just says they were philoi malista, special friends. He doesn't say why. He takes for granted that we will know that they both claim to be Spartan colonies. Ira Molkin has discussed that, but the solution to that philoi malista problem was already seen by Heinrich Stein in the 19th century. Again, Thucydides, this is number 12 on the handout, describing the forces at Syracuse, says, the Kerkyrians were fighting against the Corinthians and Syracusans, though colonists of the former and kin, Syngenis, of the latter, meaning sisters. Kerkyra, a sister of Syracuse, because both were daughter cities of Corinth. The Asopidae are a very interesting case because they're a sisterhood and nothing else. Because it didn't really matter which river Asopos you chose. There were lots of rivers. Asopos is a very flexible sort of myth. 2 of the Asopidae were Thebe, the anonymous nymph of Boeotian Thebes, and Aegina. That is exploited, number 10 on the handout, by Pindar, Herodotus, and indeed by Thucydides, in my view. Kerkyra, Corfu, Corsara, is another of Asopos' daughters, number 13 on the handout. And here we have Black Kerkyra, where Poseidon established a home for Asopos' daughter. He's transferred it to Kersula, further up the Adriatic. Sinope in the Black Sea is another daughter of Asopos. And it's a remarkable fact that in Apollonius, the only mention of Miletus by name is one of the Argonauts is said to have come from there. And that's it, as far as specific mentions of Miletus came. And I stress, it's overwhelmingly an area of historical Milesian settlement, with a few Megarians thrown in. When Apollonius does mention a historical tradition of colonization, he always flags it as a future event, as when he says the Corinthian Bacchiads settled Kerkyra at a later time, number 16 on the handout. There's a particularly good example of that precision in the only allusion, not by name, to the Milesians as the historical colonists of the northeast of the Greek world. He's talking about Artachii, which is in Herodotus. He says, later on, Metopisthen, in accordance with Apollo's oracle, the Ionian sons of Neleus dedicated that first stone as was proper in the temple of Athena. Those must be the Milesians. The Scholiast gets that wrong, and no modern commentator I can think of, I've checked, sees that this is the Neleus, Nileos, spelt differently, is the founder of Miletus in Herodotus. That's a clear but oblique reference. Well, a more famous example is this one on the foundation of Thera from Sparta. The very end of the poem, Euphemus takes heart from the prophecy, blah-de-blah. Later they left Sparta, led by Thera. But this happened after the time of Euphemus, metopin. See, very, very punctilious flagging of the event as in the future. It's been commented on by historians that it's strange that there's no mention of Kyrene there. That's been seen as propagandist to try the silence, perhaps reflecting Ptolemaic refusal, denial of Batiad claims to the neighbouring kingdom Cyrenaica, which is now Ptolemaic, at least claimed by the Ptolemies. Whether you can read that much in, I don't know. Richard Hunter is sceptical. We should also, before we leave Apollonius, notice the lost fragmentary poems about city foundations, which I think would have had much more about historical events. They're very short, except for number 13, which is about Lesbos. Most of the cities, Knidos, Kaunos, have Ptolemaic links. And the poem, this is number 20 on the handout, on the Ctisis, the foundation of Knidos in southwestern Asia Minor, Caria, probably talked about Sparta, because Knidos claimed Spartan origin. And I'm tempted to explain that in terms of the Crimonidean War of the 260s, where the Spartans are said in an inscription to have been friends and allies of King Ptolemy. So I can write a fantasy poem all about that, but we don't actually have it, so I will move quickly on. Now I'm going to turn properly to prophecy, having dealt with an author who doesn't much use it. I'm still not quite ready for Lycophron, whom most people hate, so you'll be glad that I'm postponing him for as long as possible. I'll begin with a third of the Jewish Greek hexameter Sibylline oracles. That's the earliest and most historically important of the set, probably mid-2nd century BC. And my example, which I'll give in a moment, will be the section about the Rhodians and their varying Hellenistic fortunes and their good relations with the Romans until it all went pear-shaped after 189 BC. I think the Rhodian-Roman relationship is there in Lycophron too, but only indirectly, in a section about Philoctetes. It's surprising. When Philoctetes has fallen, the river Crathis will see his tomb aslant the temple of Alios, god of Patera, Apollo, where Noithus belches its waters at the sea. As Ausonians, that's Achaeans, will kill him as he goes to the help of Lindian, that's Rhodian commanders. What are these Rhodians doing in South Italy? There's no archaeological or historical evidence for such a presence. It is mentioned in this treatise by pseudo-Aristotle, same material, possibly from Timaeus of Tauromenium, who's also drawn on by Lycophron. And I think the key to the puzzle is in Rhodian friendship with the Romans. The Romans sent a successful colony to Crotone, which is where Philoctetes came from, in 194 BC. right? And so they succeeded where their Rhodian friends had failed in myth-historical time. I'll come back to that point. Polybius, there, on the Roman-Rhodian friendship, dates it nearly 140 years from 167. Well, Maurice Olot didn't like that, so he thought, well, why don't I amend Polybius to make it suit my theory? He tried to read 40 years, not 140. Well, that's generally agreed to be wrong. William Harris has recently, on the bibliography, shown that the beginnings of Roman sea power should be pushed back as early as the late 4th century BC. The Rhodians stayed on the right side of Rome for a very long time, and they gained hugely after the Peace of Apamea, which again we heard about yesterday in connection with Isauria, having contributed to the defeat by Rome of both Philip V and then of the Seleucid Antiochus III, especially at the sea battle of Myonisos in 190 BC. But it started to go badly wrong a few years later. The big mistake, number 23 on the handout, was to, well, the first mistake was to escort Seleucus IV's daughter Laodike by sea to her bridegroom Perseus, king of Macedon. Big mistake. The word is nymphagogia. It's used on it's a wonderful Hellenistic inscription in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which reports this. And the word is used, very rare, by Lycophron about the Argo taking Medea to her marriage. And it's been suggested that the poet has mythical Laodike in mind, has that historical Laodike in mind when he's narrating the fate of the mythical Laodike in the poem. Well, the turnaround in Rhodian fortunes was complete in 167. They made the disastrous error of trying to mediate between Perseus and the Romans. You don't do that with the Romans. And they were punished severely by having Delos declared a free port. That hit their commercial interest. Well, that doesn't sound like the stuff of poetry, does it? But wait. And thou, O Rhodes, says the Sibylline oracle, shalt for a long time escape slavery, thou daughter of the day. That's the Helios, the sun cult. No? And great shall be thy wealth in later times. True. And on the sea thou shalt have power preeminent over others. Thalassocracy. True. But in the end thou shalt be a prey to thy lovers. Erasdice. Very, very strong word. Remember that from Thucydides. With thy beauty and wealth, a grievous yoke shalt thou not have put upon thy neck, put upon thy neck. In other words, it was their own fault, which is true. Well, that's a remarkable history of Hellenistic roads in a nutshell. You couldn't ask for a better one. Well, now, at last, I'm afraid, Lycophron's Alexandra. It consists of 1,474 lines of iambic trimeters, the metre of the last of the non-choral parts of classical tragedy. The poem purports to be a prophecy by the Trojan princess Cassandra, the most beautiful of Priam's daughters. She foretells the entire Europe-Asia conflict from before the main Trojan War to the Roman conquest of Greece, a remarkable exercise in historiography. It can be seen as a huge tragic messenger speech because a guard reports to Priam, this is how the thing is bookended, you've got a short bit by the guard at the beginning saying, she came out of her cave and she spoke as follows in riddling, then she speaks in perfect Greek for 1,430 lines or so, and then he says, well, that was it. And then she scooted back into her little cell. Well, the poem exemplifies my category 2, which is tragedy, as well as category 4, prophecy. I think it dates from the early 2nd century, around 190 BC, and is not by the known tragic poet Lycophron of Chalkis a century earlier, time of Philadelphus. I think the famous, I put it on the projector, the glory of the race of my grandfathers, the Trojans, will be greatly increased by the Romans. With their spears, they're very famous passages, they will win the victory wreath and first spoil, taking Gis kai thalassis sceptre kai monarchian, sceptre and kingship over land and sea. Famous historical problem. How could that be said in, say, 280 or 270 BC? I don't think it was. And that's the main historical objection to the earlier date. Perfectly all right in 190. The poem shows literary knowledge also, this is a literary argument, of the great 3rd century poets, Callimachus, above all, Apollonius, Theocritus, lots of others. So that's when I put it. And historical knowledge of the Hannibalic War, and this is the main thing I want to talk about today and the rest of today. Well, Cassandra doesn't suffer from the disadvantage of the anonymous narrator of Apollonius's Elga Nautica, because she can see forwards as well as backwards. She's like the queen on the narrative chessboard. I pointed out a few moments ago that Apollonius feels obliged to flag historical events specifically with that metopin or metopisthe formula. Cassandra doesn't have to do that. It's all in the future, and she has prophetic vision. So there's lots of explicit and unapologetic knowledge of historical events. And she does so by narrating, above all, the Greek settlements of the Aeolid, that's the area opposite Lesbos, then Ionian Miletus, and then the Dorian southeast Aegean. That's a long section near the end of the poem which recounts in Herodotean mode the clashes between Asia and Europe down to the Roman takeover. After that long colonization subsection, the narrative becomes even more obviously historical. There's a section on Midas, where the poet conflates the historical king with the mythical Midas of whom we heard yesterday from Alexander Traxel. Then Cassandra narrates with clear and in detail indebtedness to Herodotus the invasion of Greece by Xerxes and its humiliating failure. Xerxes isn't named. If you look at number 26 on the handout, he's called a single giant of the seed of Perseus. A giant. Well, why the giant? I think that echoes Herodotus, who said that, a very surprising thing for Herodotus to say, well, of all this vast army, there is nobody more qualified to lead it than Xerxes for his height and good looks. Well, that's a qualification, like Saul in the Bible, who's a head and shoulder. I've just written an article in Selecta Classica, if you're interested, called What Alcibiades Did and Suffered, but not what he looked like. Because Thucydides never tells us what anybody looked like, except in medical context and where he's imitating Herodotus. So if you're interested, but I think that's a clear echo of Herodotus. Well, otherwise, specific allusions in Lycophron are quite rare. There's an allusion to a classical Athenian strategos, the general Diotimos, son of Strombikos, who visited Naples. Naples, Neapolis. That's going to be very important in what I have to say. Alexander is the fierce lion born from Iacchos and Dardanus, who will put to sleep the grave conflict between Europe and Asia. There we are. And be celebrated as the greatest among his friends, taking the first offerings of the spear once more. I think that has to be, like Ziegler, I think it's Quinctius Flamininus, consul of 197 BC. Well, Alexander the Great, coming back to him, his illegitimate son Heracles by Barsine, daughter of the Persian satrap Artabazdos, is the subject of the most explicit allusion in the poem. Number 27 on the handout. Number 26 was Xerxes. The only mention of a historical character by name in the poem, Heracles. And it's a riddle because you think it's going to be Heracles, the mythical figure, but it's Heracles who is killed by Polyperchon in 309 BC, as recorded by Diodorus of Sicily using Hieronymus of Cardia. A curious mention. At the feast he will kill him. I think Hieronymus of Cardia, the great historian of the successors, also lies behind a more remarkable and longer section of the poem, namely that concerning the removal of the bones of Hector from a place called Ophrinion near Troy to Boeotian Thebes. This is how it goes. As a great hero, you, my brother, will dwell on the islands of the blessed, when the sown people of Ogygia, the Thebans, obedient to an oracle, will lift you out of your grave at Ophrinion and bring you to Thebes and to be a saviour hero. Well, Ophrinion is here, near Troy, okay? And that is a remarkable cult of relics because it's not mentioned in any Attic tragedy. It's not mentioned in the Boeotians' Pindar or Hesiod. So how's it come? It's a fully fledged myth, and we hear quite a few later authors use it. Albert Schachter brilliantly suggested in his book Cults of Boeotia that this somehow is connected with Cassandros' refoundation of Thebes in 316 BC. Cassandros hated Alexander. It's a deliberate reversal of Alexander's destruction of Thebes in 335 BCE. we know about that from Diodorus and an inscription, number 29 on the handout. I'll go back to the, I do that. Yeah, that's the Lycophron passage. Well, my solution, which I argued for in commentary on Lycophron 2 years ago, is this, that Homer's Achilles sacked a city called Thebe, but it wasn't the ocean Thebes, it was a little city here, which is from where Andromache came. And I think there may have been a mythical Syngenia link, a kinship link, between the two identically named Aeolian places. And I suggest that Lycophron's source here was Hieronymus of Cardia, who was governor of Boeotian Thebes in the 290s. That's a attested fact. And is the source of Diodorus' material in this area, not in the early books, a different source, I think, from what's used in the early books. Well, the evidence for the early Hellenistic refoundation of Thebes is partly epigraphic. I could spend the rest of the lecture talking about occasions on which the poem receives unexpected corroboration from epigraphy. The most famous example concerns the rape of Cassandra and the atonement by sending the Locrian maidens to atone for this is Ajax's rape of Cassandra. Here she's got some clothes on, and here she doesn't have any clothes on, which probably means rape. It's not clear whether there's actual sexual intercourse, and the iconography is ambiguous there. But for that horror, which is both impious as well as hubris, because the assault takes place in the temple of Athena, right? And Athena punishes 1,000 years they have to send a maiden, and dreadful atonement. And Lycophron describes this in great detail. And this is Lockery. And nobody could have predicted that at the beginning of the 20th century, a prose inscription published by Adolf Wilhelm would show that some maidens were indeed sent from Lockery to Troy. And that's the squeeze impression of the inscription, which we have a copy of in Oxford. And the ritual seems to have been a historical fact. And I've suggested that this site here, Fiskais, the inscription was found here at Tolophone. Fiskais had a temple of Athena Ilias. Athena of Troy, yes? So what probably happened was this is a local initiatory marriage ritual, which is perfectly innocuous. In Lycophron, the Trojans are waiting with clubs and swords, and they run the gauntlet to get into the city. And it's amazing they do. Well, the first attested author who describes it is Aeneas Tacticus in the middle of the 4th century. He's clearly got the fact of the ritual correct, but he's interpreted it, well, it's clearly a ritual charade by which the maidens are allowed in. But I suggest that since the sources, including Timaeus, but above all Lycophron, talk about Troy, what probably happened was that, say, every 4 years, there was a kind of theoria from Lockery to Troy. The annual marital ritual took place in this local sanctuary. That's a remarkable piece of history in Lycophron. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm writing a monograph at the moment for OUP, which is to be called Lycophron's Alexander, Rome and the Hellenistic World. Was that me? Software changes are required, it said. I hope not. It doesn't like Lycophron. Well, what I'm trying to do in this book is to take a different line. I start from the composition date in the 190s. We're still all right for time. I think we're going to hit 1:30 pretty well closely. All right? If you're starving, slip out now while I have a glass of water. You've been sitting through a long AGM, haven't you? While I was checking in with LL tomorrow. Well, at the 190s, what's going on in the 190s? Not an easy period. Italy is recovering from the trauma of Hannibal's invasion. I argue that Lycophron shows awareness of a number of south and central Italian places which feature in the 3rd decade of Livy. That's books 21 to 30. The only surviving uninterrupted narrative we have of the Second Punic War. it seems to me reasonable to expect, that's a sort of cautious scholarly way of saying here I go into wild conjecture, that this would have left marks on a poem which reaches its climax with Flamininus. Cassandra's word kinsman, she says, my one wrestler kinsman, refers to the Roman commander who's anonymous, but I agree with Ziegler that it's Flamininus. And that presupposes the myth of Rome as daughter city of Troy because of the foundational activity of the refugee Aeneas. More on that later. Many passages of the Alexandra, I argue, make specially good sense as implying knowledge of what Hannibal had been up to in Italy and Hasdrubal in Spain. Start with a simple example. The context is Odysseus visiting Campania. Here at Campania here, right? Long section just before the dead centre of the poem. And in this poem, the halfway point, these milestones are very significant. Line 737 is the middle point of the poem. And the climax, which is the Siren Parthenope, who is the eponym of Naples, Napoli, Neapolis, the Roman city of Naples, very important naval base. That is one of the few places in the poem to be mentioned Neapolitae. Mostly this poet is infuriating in the way he refuses to name anything straightforwardly. So Odysseus never gets named. He's the stealer of the Palladion and so forth. Well, the friendship of Naples was crucial to Roman denial of the seas to Carthage in the Hannibalic War. It's a fundamental point about the defeat of Hannibal. He lacked reinforcement. However many Roman armies he defeated, he was never able to consolidate the position, partly because the Italians didn't go over to him, but above all because he was denied reinforcement. Naples was the first of Rome's socii navales, naval allies, and received a very favourable foedus treaty in 326 BC. Now, after the Battle of Cannae, when Hannibal, 216 BCE, when Hannibal annihilated two Roman consular armies, he marched against Naples. He needed reinforcement, and it's on your hand number 31. Livy says that he wanted to besiege Naples, oppugnaturus Neapolin ut urbem maritimam haberet, that he should have a good harbour. So he failed, remained loyal, so he turned against Capua instead. Naples went on being of value to Rome in the war against Antiochus. Livius Salinator set out from there with a huge fleet on his way to the Aegean in 191 BC. Sea power is vital to Roman success in the Middle Republic, and we recall that Lycophron specified Roman dominion by land and sea, gis kai thalasses. Well, Lycophron had his sources among prose historians, no less than Callimachus. Timaeus, and this is number 32 on the handout, told us that the Athenian Diotimos, who's known from Thucydides and an inscription from 431 or so, Diotimos, son of Strombichus, went to Naples for Cassandra, number 32. He goes there. He's the commander of the whole fleet of Mopsops. Mopsops? Well, that's an early mythical king of Athens. So that's an example of his refusal. The Scholiast says this is Timaeus, fragment 98. So we happen to know that was in Timaeus' history. The place was then recolonized by the Athenians. Diotimos set up a torch race at Naples. It'll be in the 430s BC. They seem to have recolonized Naples in the Periclean period. The name Neapolis, old city, implies new city, implies Palaeopolis, an old city, and Livy indeed uses that word. Lycophron then deeply interested in Campania. Well, here's more speculative thought. The rivers of the underworld, conventionally located in Campania, are the subject of some very powerful lines in the poem. The most famous of these places was still an active pilgrimage site in the time of Lycophron. Lake Avernus, Aornos, the place of no birds, yes? And Cassandra, number 33 on the handout, calls that the lake of Aornos encircled by a noose. It was home to a cult of the dead and indeed a necromanteon, an oracle of the dead. Well, it received a very distinguished visitor in 214 BCE, no less than Hannibal himself, who sacrificed there. And Livy, Livy's source probably, says this is a pretense to mask a surprise attack on Puteoli. And the strategic motive is a good one because he needed good access to the sea, as we've seen. But Livy also says that Hannibal did indeed make the intended sacrifice. To whom? To what barked ancestral spirit did he pray? What murdered ghost did he invoke? I like to think. Well, so unusual a consultant won't have been easily forgotten in the 190s, a few years later, when Lycophron was touring the sacred places of the region, gathering information, as I like to imagine him doing. Well, even more speculative, the war against Hannibal in Spain. At the end of a curious narrative about Boeotian colonization of the Balearic Islands, this is number 34 on the handout, we get a mention of Tartessos in the southern Spain. Why that? Completely irrelevant to the narrative. The vast silver-bedded streams of Tartessos' river were known to Stesichorus in the 6th century. Lycophron talks about the gates of Tartessos, number 34 on the handout, as I said. Why should that remote part of Spain feature in the Alexandra? Well, look at Livy. Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus' victory over Hasdrubal Barca at Baecula in 208 BC is just round the corner from Tartessos. In particular, Ilipa, where he defeated Hannibal, son of Gisco, is also in southern Spain. It actually adjoins Tartessus. In between those two battles, Hasdrubal crossed over to Italy to join his brother, but he was killed at the Battle of the Metauros in 207 BC. And that was the end of Hannibal's hopes, defeated by Livius Salinator and Claudius Nero, as elaborated in a famous ode of Horace. Those faraway successes contributed as much to Hannibal's defeat as the war in Italy. And I suggest there in Lycophron, as indeed is Carthage there. Well, the mention of the Kinips, number 35 on the handout, is very strange geographically, and commentators have been puzzled. But it was part of the Carthaginian Empire until absorbed in Massinista's Numidian kingdom. Number 35, I've given the material on that. There's plenty in the poem about the Phoenicians, who are the colonizers of Carthage, and indeed of Malta, which is a Carthaginian possession and an important naval base. Well, Italy itself is Hannibal's base for many years, and that's certainly left traces on the Alexandra. Diomedes, I mentioned already as having cult at Palagrusa in the Adriatic, the subject of two very lengthy excursuses in the poem. They both concern Daunia, modern Puglia, which is here. And he's said to have founded Arpi, Argyripa in Greek, Arpi in Latin. Very important city in the Hannibalic War. The Dacii, who are the elite family there, claimed Aetolian descent. Why is that important? Hang on, there we are. The land of Daunia will be infertile, says Cassandra, until someone deriving from Diomedes' own Aetolian stock, he's son of Tydeus, he's Aetolian, right, in myth, should dig the land. Who are these Aetolian stock? The answer is the Dacii, this family, who are attested in Appian's Hannibalic War as having claimed descent from Diomedes. I've given you the evidence for that under number 36 on the handout. Yeah, Appian Hannibalica 31. Can you still hear me at the back if you're still listening? I'm afraid there's nothing but Lycophron from now on. Tough. Okay, so I think that the Dacius, whom Livy calls Dacius Altinius, he begins by supporting Carthage, try to reverse that later. The Aetolians are very important in the high politics of the late 3rd and beginning of the 2nd century BC. The cause of the war with Antiochus, Aetolia. Why should the Aetolians be so prominent? I suggest that there's a Hannibalic aspect. His occupation, Hannibal's occupation of Magna Graecia, let's go back to, Magna Graecia is left its mark, I think, on the Alexandria at a place called Skeleteion, which is between Locri and Crotone down there. That's Hannibal's main military centre near Crotone. And the name, this is number 37 on the handout, Cassandra talks about the Scylletian maiden, referring to Athena. That's a strange epithet to use. Well, we happen to know that a Roman colony, Scolacium Minervium, was founded and then refounded by the Romans, most recently under Nerva. Minerva is, of course, Athena. It does seem clear that this is intended to suggest Scyllетria, but is also a word for spoil, scula. So typically, a lycophone, like myself, is having it both ways. Well, come back to Philoctetes now. The epic cycle brought Philoctetes home to Thessaly. So his Italian adventures are a post-classical development. Glenn Bowersock, in his book on fiction and history, discusses the reception of the Philoctetes myth at Rome, suggested that Philoctetes had a particular appeal for the Roman descendants of the Trojans as a Greek maltreated by his fellow Greeks, and that his transplantation to Italy is part of an effort to, quote, co-opt Philoctetes for the cause of the new Roman state. That's on the bibliography. Well, why should a 2nd century Greek poet treat these places as he does? By the 280s BC, the Greek colonies were being pressurized. Locri, Caulonia and Rhegium, Thurii, Crotone, they're in serious trouble, and they had to submit to Pyrrhus in the 270s. They had to submit again in the Carthaginian presence of Hannibal after 216. Pettalia, which is near to Crotone, just here, held out for longest and was thanked for its loyalty. And it's about Crotone, which is evacuated completely after 216, that Livy made his famous generalization about, on class lines, about the Hannibalic War. All the Italian cities were infected by a kind of disease, so that a division of opinion opened between optimates and plebeians, the Senate favouring the Romans, the plebs, the Carthaginians. Well, Badian and others have picked that to pieces. It doesn't work as a wholesale generalization, but Crotone was clearly symbolically important. Benedictus Nyssa called Crotone Hannibal's Hauptwaffenplatz, his military arsenal. Hannibal inscribed his achievements, we know this from Polybius and Livy, at the temple of Hero Lacinia at Crotone, Juno Lacinia. Sanctuary was a great religious centre. Lycophron makes Cassandra, number 39 on the handout, describe a festival of mourning for Achilles, ordained by Hera because Achilles' mother Thetis gave Hera the land at Crotone on which the temple complex was built. When I now come back to that small Roman citizen colony of 194 BC, which is a bit of a puzzle, it's most unlikely to have had a military purpose. It's tiny. They'd been overwhelmed long before help came. I suggest that it had a symbolic function. The Rhodians had failed to establish a colonial presence in South Italy, but their Roman allies inherited the role of metropolis, just as the victorious Romans redeemed the fall of their mother city, Troy. Most of the other colonies sent out in the 190s are also in Lycophron. Sipontum, Tempsa, Temesa, that's to say. They're all of them mentioned in Lycophron. Pettalia would have fitted into an iambic trimeter, and it's where Virgil associated Philoctetes with, rather than with Crotone. Strabo called it a foundation of Philoctetes. Well, historians remembered Pettalia for its loyalty to Rome and the fact that they were in extremity of hunger, so they were eating the bark from the trees. I think that that description is copied from Herodotus' description of the vivid bark chewing of Xerxes' retreating army. So there is an indirect reference to Pettalia after all. Well, that's pretty speculative, isn't it? Let's move on finally to what has always been recognised as the most important passage of the Alexandra, namely the Aeneas section. We've got just 5 minutes to go, right?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Well, that's we're nearly there. I went to a lecture by Henk Versnell once, and he said, 10 pages to go, and then a bit later, 5 pages to go, so you knew where you are. Well, that theme, Roman descent from Trojan refugees, was captured so effectively by Virgil that it's easy to overlook that Lycophron got there first among poets by a very long margin, even longer if you don't accept my late dating for the poem. Philadelphus, that's amazing. The story of the eating of the tables, you know, the story of Ascanius and the oracle about settling where they ate the table. It's a kind of cledone, a chance utterance that has oracular power. The sow with the 30 piglets, which is Latium. They're all there in Lycophron for the first time, and Dionysius much later. The twins Romulus and Remus appear now. It's not quite the earliest, it's a very early mention. Here we have it on the screen. My kinsman Aeneas will leave behind him such twin lion whelps. I've given the Greek on the handout, number 40. Exicon chrome genos. Chrome in strength. Clearly a play on the name Rome. Used to be thought that Melino's hymn to Rome was the earliest use of that play on the Greek word for strength, Romi and Rome. But that is now dated to the Hadrianic period by the best authorities. So Lycophron is way first. We know from an inscribed library catalogue from Tauromenium, this is all on number 40, that Fabius Pictor, in his Greek history, mentioned the twins the end of the 3rd century. And they're depicted on Roman silver coins of the earlier 3rd century. And I think that's where Lycophron would have first come across the legend. They got cult in Rome in the 290s from the Ogulnii. Roman silver coins circulate after about 300. I think even a learned poet like Lycophron didn't get all his material from written sources. So here we have the Trojan descent of Rome merged with a more modern local version of the Roman foundation myth in terms of Romulus and Remus. Well, as we've seen already once, but I'll give it to you again, Flamininus is described as a kinsman. Well, that's interesting for another reason. Number 42 and 43. Peter Wiseman pointed out a few years ago that another figure, Acilius Glabrio, who's consul, a novus homo, claimed to be an Aenead himself, a descendant of Aeneas. Flamininus is not the only person to be doing this. That kind of claim seems to have been topical in the 190s when Lycophron was writing. Well, I'm going to end now, just a page to go, with a last example of sisterhood, a very interesting and important sisterhood, which is the Sicilian cities here, known from Thucydides, Egesta, Entella, Eryx. Thucydides named only 2, they're called Elymian cities, Elymian. And they are, this is number 41 on the handout. Eryx, Egesta, Entella. What's their importance? For Thucydides, there are only 2, namely Eryx and Egesta. Entella is the last in time to achieve prominence here. We know about this, above all, from a very important dossier of Hellenistic inscriptions published in 1980. Ampelo is about to do a definitive edition. It clearly came to prominence after Thucydides' time. All 3 claimed Trojan ancestry, so they're sisters of Rome, if you think back to the Assopidae. Livy describes how the patron goddess of Eryx, Venus Erycina, lightened the dark hour of Roman history after Trasimene, when the consul Flaminius, not to be confused with Flamininus 20 years later, was killed at the lake in 217 BC. The Romans were ordered by the Sibylline books to vow a temple to Venus Erycina, Venus of Eryx, and to Mens. 2 years later, a new temple to that Venus was dedicated on the Capitol. As Andrew Erskine puts it, Trojan kinship may have been a factor. It meant the Romans had a better right to the goddess than the Carthaginians. Well, Apollonius and Callimachus mentioned Eryx, but they show no awareness of Troy or Carthage or the First Punic War. It's above all Egesta which attracts Cassandra's attention. Unhappy Egesta, for you by divine ordinance there shall be great and eternal mourning for my fatherland, Troy. Well, compare Cassandra and Troy itself. Woe, my wretched nurse. That's the way the poet makes comparisons. The language replicates the earlier cry of pity. Neatly makes the point that Egesta, like Rome, is another Troy and is wretched because of the fall of the mother city, Troy. Okay? Eric Gruen showed in a series of books in about 1990 to 92 that the original context of this myth of Egesta is the First Punic War, from 262 to 241 BC. A passage of Cicero's Verrines is the main evidence. So I think the long section about the Elymian cities and Eryx in particular has a remarkable topicality. in this period. Well, I sum up. We've seen that Pindar's Medea may have alluded obscurely and by pseudo-prophecy to the historical founding of Kyrene. But Lycophone's volume of historical colonial Greek material presented as prophecy is far greater than this. And for some episodes about the founding of Rome, for which Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Virgil are usually cited, Lycophone is far and away the first literary evidence. Surviving literary evidence. We don't have Fabius Pictor. As for contemporary politics, what I've said about Hannibal is speculative in varying degrees, but there's no doubt that the closing parts of the poem about the Roman conquest of Greece, the unique kinsman and so on, are the work of a profoundly political poet, and I would say a kind of historian. Thank you. Right.